we've had quite a few clients coming to us, asking us, how do we make sure that this is covered in our terms, even though we're not exactly sure what these changes are going to look like. I think one of the key things that's obviously coming up a lot now is the use of AI in financial services. It's important from a DEI perspective to make sure that everyone's included, etc. If people don't have the tools to talk about race comfortably and openly, a lot of those things tend not to be successful. It's definitely more prominently on the agenda for a lot of the big law firms. That's also partly because it's been client driven. Everybody felt the need to kind of assimilate and be like everybody else to be successful, whereas there are a lot more examples now of people who do things differently, who are from different backgrounds, who are successful in law and who have made that their thing.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Nikki Ogun. Nikki is a senior associate in the global regulatory team at Hogan Lovells in London. She specializes in providing business regulatory advice to businesses in the payments, banking, and lending industry. She has previously completed secondments at the likes of Lloyds Banking Group and HSBC. Nikki is passionate about advancing diversity at Hogan Lovells and is a member of the committee of the Hogan Lovells Black and Minority Ethnic Network. She is also the proud co-founder of the Black Women's Law Network. Nikki volunteers her time to speak and educate individuals at legal careers events in London, focusing on diversity. So a very big warm welcome, Nikki.
Thank you, Rob. Good to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Before we dive into all your amazing projects, experiences to date, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it, on the scale of 1 to 10?
I would say it depends. That's such a lawyer answer. I would probably give it a 7. I would say maybe 6, 7. I'd say 6, 7. I think if I was a US lawyer, I might give it a different answer. Because obviously a lot of the things that happen on there are quite like US law specific.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think 6, 7. Yeah.
6, 7, fair answer. And with that, let's move swiftly on to talk all about you. So would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Yeah, sure. So I am a senior associate at Hogan Lovells. In terms of my background and what I do, so I do regulated financial services law. So primarily advisory law, advising the full spectrum of financial services clients on complying with law and regulation around regulated financial services. When I say financial services clients, that has to be caveated now because we have not just, your typical banking clients, but we have people who are in the fintech space. We have people who actually don't offer financial services as their kind of bread and butter, but they do have an aspect of their business which involves payments, banking, lending. And we're finding a lot of companies do that more now than they used to. So when I say full spectrum, it really is full spectrum. In terms of my journey into law, so I never know how far back to go, but I studied law at the University of Nottingham. That was after a short stint of trying to study economics and changing course. So when I finally left the Uni of Nottingham, I was made an offer to train at Hogan Lovells, which I accepted very happily. That was my first choice of law firm. I then went to BPP Law School. So I did the LPC as it was then. I did the accelerated LPC, so I was only doing it for 6 months. And then I joined my firm in the summer of 2017. So I did 4 seats. I did data protection. I did regulated financial services, which is where I have now qualified. I did a client secondment to Lloyds Banking Group in their consumer finance team. And then finally, I did a seat in financial services litigation. So a very kind of financial services, reg advisory heavy training contract experience. And then, I qualified into my team in 2019. I've been very happily working there since, and then very recently got promoted to senior associate. So that was end of April, so a few months ago. So I'm a very junior senior associate. But yeah, that's kind of like a quick whistle-stop tour of my journey. And obviously we'll go into a bit more detail about specific aspects as we have our chat, but that is me.
Yeah, and it's super impressive. And yeah, obviously super fast career progression as well, which is inspiring for our listeners. And yeah, Nottingham University, I know that well. I had friends there, partaked in Campus 14, I have to admit. And I love the energy there in university. But let's go quickly one step back before that. What inspired your wish to pursue a career in law? Or is it something you just fell into?
Good question. I initially wanted to be a banker. And as I kind of hinted, tried to study economics in kind of pursuance of that career. Um, I think so. I come from a legal background, actually. My mum and dad are both lawyers. Funnily enough, my dad actually used to be at Hogan Lovells when I was like 3 years old. Yeah, he was originally a tax lawyer. At Hogan Lovells. Back then it was called Lovells White Durant, but same firm. And I think a part of me was kind of trying to be a bit of a rebel. And so the obvious choice would have been for me to just go directly into law, don't waste time, do your law degree. It's the obvious choice. I had quite a bit of legal experience, just, bits and bobs of like helping out my mum and dad in the office. And then also, during secondary school, they encourage you to do all sorts of different types of work experience. And a lot of the work experience I did was quite law heavy because that was the easiest thing to do given my background. I personally was really interested in banking, at least, that's what I felt coming out of college. I enjoyed economics. And I thought, yeah, I could do a good job as a banker. And so the initial decision to study economics was, I think I learned quite quickly that my skills didn't really align very well with doing a straight economics degree. There was a lot of maths in there, and I'm sure you hear lots of lawyers on this podcast talk about how maths is just not their thing. And I was more interested in kind of the social side of economics, so to speak. So I think I was humbled a bit by how advanced the maths was. And there were other aspects of it that, to be honest, I didn't find that interesting. Begs the question why I went into it in the first place. But I think at that point I'd been kind of used to like making the right academic decisions. Nothing was particularly challenging to the point where I couldn't do it. So everything was kind of conquerable. But I think uni is where that kind of stopped. And so when I realized that economics wasn't for me, it was quite soon. It was probably like end of my first year, I would say. I was very much like, this is not the degree for me. And at that point, I then had to think a lot more sensibly about what my next steps were going to be, because as far as I was concerned, not only was time running out in my head anyway, but also uni is not free, right? So I've spent a year doing something that I wasn't enjoying, and I had to make what I felt was the best decision about where to go next. And at that point, as I'd said, I'd had a lot of legal work experience. I had done enough of economics to know that my skills didn't lie in the kind of statistical analytics side of things. But I really enjoyed the reading and writing side of economics. So I think the move into law was governed by, number one, my background up until that point. It was very like law focused, and I had practical legal work experience that at least told me that I would do okay in the job. And so that was my next move. I decided not to stay on the economics course. I spent a year almost reapplying for the law degree because I guess as far as my uni were concerned, they were like, well, you could just stay on economics and do a conversion course. But I felt so strongly about, the fact that I wasn't enjoying myself on the economics course, and I didn't see myself spending 2 more years doing something that really just wasn't for me. So managed to persuade the uni to let me change to study law instead. And so it's not the typical answer where people say, I was passionate about law from a really young age and I knew that I wanted to go into it. I could have gone into it earlier, but I think that if I had studied law to start with, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much, because in my mind, I would have been thinking that, there's something else I should be doing or could be doing. Whereas actually, I think the way that I did it was almost in the reverse, tried something else. I was like, that is definitely not for me. And so then I had to think about, okay, well, what is for me? What are your skills? What can you do well? What would you genuinely enjoy? And I think that's what then kind of pushed me around to doing law. And the benefit of having done my first year of uni already and then doing it again with the law degree is that I kind of knew exactly what to do. I hit the ground running. So I didn't have the first year of mucking about that some people have at uni, because I'd done a first year already and I didn't want to have to, do it again. So yeah, like slightly different route into deciding that I wanted to be a lawyer, but I am happy with the decision, so that's good. Yeah, so
and the success speaks for itself as well in terms of how you progressed. And I guess let's get up to sort of present day, because we've touched on it. You're a senior associate at Hogan Lovells in the sort of global regulatory side of things. So again, for those that are less familiar, you touched on it before. Tell us a little bit more about the regulatory advice. Touch on a bit more around the clients and what a typical day looks like for you. I think that'll be super helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, good question. And to be honest, this is one that I try to get across quite a bit, because when you hear about law firms like Hogan Lovells and other similar size firms, people talk a lot about the corporate work, the transactional work, see a lot about disputes, litigation, arbitration, etc. I don't think that reg and advisory work gets the spotlight that some of the other areas of law do. So it's nice to be able to do that. And so essentially the way that I try to describe it to people is that there are a lot of areas of law that are very highly regulated. So, you have the side where a client obviously has to think about, a piece of legislation, other different types of laws that might apply to them. But in terms of how they run day to day, it's not necessarily based on kind of specific legislation or laws. Whereas in the industries that my clients operate in, there is that angle where they have to also think not only about what law applies to them, but also what a regulator is doing, so what the regulator thinks. In my area, it's mainly the Financial Conduct Authority or the Prudential Regulation Authority. And there are other kind of relevant regulatory bodies as well in the financial services space. And so what that does is it makes the advice that we have to give them quite specific. So not just, okay, this is how you comply with the law, but also the regulator in this space is very focused on the area that you're trying to go into. And these are the things that you need to focus on to make sure that you not only get it right in terms of strict legal compliance, but also making sure that you maintain a good relationship with the regulators, making sure that you don't become a company that's constantly getting into trouble. That kind of thing gives you that extra layer of work to do. And I think that makes the work quite interesting and quite different, I guess, from other things that people might experience when they go into, big law firms like this. And so, as I mentioned, the clients that we work for across the board, there are so many different types, but we've served for a very long time, your very well-known banks, but we're also moving now a lot more into the kind of fintech space. So we actually have a program called the Fintech Mentor Program, where we onboard a cohort of fintech companies every year. And what we do is we provide them with £25,000 worth of free legal advice. So £25,000 each, obviously, not spread between the 10 of them. And what that does is that we get to make sure that up and coming fintech companies who might not always have the budget to spend on big law firms at the kind of early stage get the advice and support that they need to make sure that they're doing things right from the beginning. And it saves them a lot of time and money trying to correct things down the line when they've scaled up and they're looking for investment. And then it turns out that, okay, they haven't really sought the right legal advice early on. So that in that sense, it helps them a lot in terms of getting off the ground in a way that's legally compliant and making sure that it's aligned with what the regulators expect. And it also helps us to kind of learn from them, look at what they're doing, see how they do things differently, and kind of think about how to apply some laws and regulations that have been around for a long time to very new and innovative styles of business. And what happens typically at the end in the happy scenario is that even once their, allocation is finished, they tend to stay with us because we've obviously given them advice from the beginning. We understand their business, how they operate, what the issues are that affect them, and we can continue to kind of maintain that relationship on an ongoing basis. So that's typically what happens with those clients. And then, as I mentioned, there are other clients who are not financial services providers typically, but who are looking at incorporating payments, lending into their day-to-day business. And we are advising those clients as well. And in terms of a day-to-day, so as I said, a lot of the work circulates around giving people advice. And that advice takes lots of different formats. So it could be, preparing a presentation on a new piece of legislation and explaining to somebody exactly how it's going to impact their business or a specific product that they've launched or are trying to launch. There could be the scenario where there's a question or an issue that's affecting the business and they need a note of advice to tell them exactly what they need to be thinking about, what the potential risks and issues are, laid out in a kind of almost essay style format, which actually is my favorite type of work. We also then have the kind of, okay, looking at new product launches, so advising on that. Again, what kind of things do they need to consider if they're moving into a new space? We have what we call, I guess, dealing with not necessarily heat issues, but you do get clients who, for whatever reason, there's been an incident or they may not have complied with a specific piece of regulation or legislation, and they're concerned about what the impact of them on them might be. And in those cases, they might, essentially ring us up in a panic and tell us what's happened and ask us to advise ad hoc. And other times it's more considered and we can like sit down with them, give them a real walkthrough of what the potential concerns might be and how to deal with it. So in some cases, they might need to remediate customers, for example, and we guide them through that whole journey. So there's lots of different types of advice that we can give. We also run surgeries. So there are clients who we kind of have like an ongoing, it might be a monthly or quarterly call with them. And we ask them to send us in questions about different aspects of law and regulation. And literally we sit on the call, we answer each one. So giving them the answers over the phone in what we call like almost like a surgery. So there are lots of different formats that advice can take. And I suppose a typical day would involve progressing each of those forms of advice. And it gives me a good mix between doing work by myself. So sometimes the advice is something that, I can do the research, I can answer the question one-on-one, and I don't need anybody else to kind of get involved or help me. And there are other times where it's a big project. If we're doing like, a big review of terms and conditions, for example, that's where you would typically have, more team members involved, from, trainee all the way up to partner. And there is a good mix of work in that sense. So I think I'm pretty much evenly split between work that I'm usually doing with other people, and then work that I might kind of be running almost independently. So yeah, the typical day, I guess there isn't really one, but I would be doing different things to progress each of those pieces of advice basically on a day-to-day basis. So it's having internal calls with the team if we're working as a team on a specific piece of work. It might be a call with the client to give them a piece of advice over the phone. A lot of it will be time spent kind of progressing the matters, just working on them, building up the advice note, preparing the presentation, or preparing for a workshop with the client, whatever it might be. So it's a mixture of those different tasks. And then obviously, spending time doing things which are not necessarily chargeable work, but which still help to develop the business of the team and the firm. And so there's that kind of aspect of things, which I would also spending at least, I would say like half an hour to an hour, depending on the day, but doing work which is not chargeable, but which is important for business development. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving such a comprehensive overview, and I like the fintech approach as well, because I always say like customer lifetime value. The more that you can kind of front load that customer lifetime value, like you say, you give them £25,000, you know their business, you build the relationship, you showcase the value. It's easily then to naturally sort of foster and nurture that. And yeah, you gave a really good broad brush of what you get up to. No 2 days the same. You talked about banks, and you've had experience of going on secondment to likes of Lloyds and HSBC. So what insights did you garner from your time with those?
So two different secondments. So I did one as a trainee to Lloyds Banking Group, as you mentioned, and I was in their consumer finance team. And then my second one was to HSBC, and I was in their global banking and markets team. And so the consumer finance one was kind of more directly related to the work that I do now, in the sense that the products that we were working on, credit cards, loans, mortgages, that's kind of like the bread and butter of my team. And I think actually from a trainee development perspective, that specific secondment was really important for me. Lloyds Banking Group are a big client of the firm, and actually I am the client development associate now for Lloyds Banking Group at my firm. But whilst I was on the secondment, I think I got a really good sense of kind of the level of development that's expected of kind of later stage trainees. So, you come into a bank where they don't necessarily have the same categorizations of, okay, a first seat trainee does this and a second seat trainee does that, and it's all very defined and understood. when I got in there, it was kind of like Nikki from legal is here, Nikki from legal is on the call. And this whole idea of, oh, well, I'm just a third seat trainee kind of went out of the window. But from a development perspective, it was really, really good for me. So in terms of like just taking charge of matters, being able to kind of give advice to the business, which is from an internal perspective. So obviously I was working in their, internal legal department. It's a different level of communication skill that you would need to use compared with communicating with clients when you're working in private practice in a law firm. So understanding how to speak to the business and give them legal advice in a way that works for them without kind of making it seem like the legal team are trying to block the business from doing everything they want to do is quite a specific skill. So I think that really helps me with my kind of client communication skills overall, because you really do understand how different your different clients are, and how important it is to know them and know their personality so that you can understand the best way to communicate your legal advice. And I think as an advisory lawyer, that is like key information that you really can't let go of. So I think that was super helpful for me. So not just being able to kind of help to maintain the relationship with a big client, but really just understanding them from the inside. I think that's what the most important thing that I got from that secondment. When I was at HSBC, the work was slightly different to what I typically do in my team. It was more like to do with banking, or providing banking and banking services to really large like global corporates. And they have a very specific type of like accounting and banking style, whereas a lot of the work that I do in my team is more around the retail and like consumer finance kind of space. Having said that, a lot of the kind of key principles around providing a banking relationship were the same. And again, I think getting that understanding of how the bank actually works internally, very useful for me. At that point, I was a qualified lawyer as well. So, the trainee bubble had popped. And I was really newly qualified. I think I had only been qualified for about, I would say maybe like 3 or 4 months when I went on that secondment. So very junior. But giving advice as a qualified lawyer felt quite different. And obviously doing it from inside the client, again, was just a really great learning perspective that I got from there. So super useful secondments. And I think in terms of being able to come back to my firm and maintain relationships with people who I had met on secondment, who you often, you end up meeting again in different places. Sometimes they move around to different banks and, you remember having done secondments with them. And it's a really great way to kind of build your client relationships. So aside from the learning that you get in terms of the actual work that you're doing, I think just understanding that client communication, having a real like commercial mindset when it comes to giving advice to clients, because you have actually worked there and you've been there, you understand how decisions are made, you understand why a massive project might get kicked off with this huge budget and everybody involved, and you're giving advice as a lawyer, and then all of a sudden there seemed to be a massive change in direction. Being able to see those kinds of things from the inside is really helpful, because when you go back to your firm, you can almost understand why certain things happen in the way that they do. And where you have specific stakeholders who are the decision makers, understanding, what might be the pressure point, what you might need to do to make sure that a specific idea or a specific way of doing things from a legal perspective can get over the line, because you might get some people in the business who are not happy with an approach to something, and you have to think about the best way to communicate that and help the business to get over that. So understanding the different stakeholders, the different decision makers, the way things work, the governance processes, valuable insight that I don't really think it's easy to get without having spent time with that client. So yeah, as you can see, I'm a big fan of secondments.
They've shaped your career, haven't they? And they've given you both sides of the coin and probably a more rounded lawyer. So I think you gave some really good case studies there. Could you give an example of a challenging regulatory issue you've helped a client navigate?
I think one of them, a good one probably to mention because it's something that's coming up soon, is about incoming changes to app scam refunds, so reimbursements for people who have basically been the victim of what we call authorized push payment fraud. So fraud where you've essentially made a payment from your bank account to somebody or for a purpose which you think is legitimate but ends up being fraudulent. And the distinction there is that it's authorized. So it's not like, someone stealing your bank card and making a transaction. It's actually, you have authorized it. You've said, yes, I want to make this payment. But unfortunately, you weren't aware that the person that you were paying was a fraudster, or what you thought you were paying for is not what you're getting, essentially. And so there are changes coming in on 7th of October about the level of reimbursement that customers can get if they are the victim of those scams. And different kind of information that has to be given. So in terms of the decision that is made about whether somebody is owed a refund or not, the length of time that has to be spent in terms of being able to give them that refund, for example. And what we found is that because of the way that and I'm trying to answer this in a way that doesn't make any specific, regulatory body look bad, but there has been a lot of kind of industry discussion about the changes that are coming in, the level of reimbursement, and also just kind of specific aspects of the changes that haven't yet been kind of completely ironed out. But because the changes are coming in so soon, and banks are required to inform customers about the way that their accounts are going to be dealt with, changes are having to be made to customers' terms and conditions to make sure that they're informing customers about these changes. And so what we've been trying to help clients navigate is, I guess, redrafting their customer terms in a way that explains what's about to happen, even though the changes haven't fully come into effect yet, and it's not entirely clear how they might play out for specific customers, because a lot of this is still kind of in flux. So there's a lot of quite kind of detailed consideration that we've had to give to the way that we describe these things. And because obviously on the one hand, you need to be legally compliant and you need to do what regulators and, the government are saying that you should do. But also in an area where things are still quite uncertain and there's a lot of debate about whether or not these changes should be being made, for example, it's quite a difficult area to grapple with. So we've had quite a few clients coming to us, asking us, how do we make sure that this is covered in our terms, even though we're not exactly sure what these changes are going to look like. And that's been quite interesting, because I think, you deal with clients who are obviously very sophisticated and very keen to get things right, but sometimes the regulatory environment that they operate in doesn't always allow them to do that in the best way. So it's kind of working with them in that sense to make sure that they get things right, essentially.
Yeah, and I love your partnering approach. Everything that you sort of describe and articulate, you're very relationship and partner driven as well, which I think is really important as a lawyer, and obviously probably why you've also progressed really well to senior associate at a relatively, low PQE level, which is great. Hey listeners, we hope you're enjoying today's episode of the Legally Speaking podcast. We want to take a quick moment to talk about something every lawyer can appreciate: saving time. That's why we're excited to introduce you to our sponsor, Cilo. Cilo, the leading cloud-based legal software, is changing how legal professionals manage their practice. With its unique suite of tools, Cilo ensures you're covered whether you're in the office, at home, or on the go, making your job easier and more efficient. Imagine this: instead of sifting through endless paperwork and juggling multiple platforms, Cilo offers a single integrated solution to manage your cases, clients, and billing. Their intuitive interface allows you to organize your tasks seamlessly, keep track of important deadlines, and communicate effortlessly with your team and clients. But the real game changer is the time you'll save. Firms using Cilo can save on average 8 hours per week on administrative tasks. That's an extra workday you can dedicate to what matters: practicing the law and serving your clients. And it gets even better. Clio's powerful analytics and reporting tools help you make data-driven decisions to continuously improve your practice. It's like having a personal assistant always on top of things, ensuring you never miss a beat. So if you're ready to elevate your practice and reclaim your time, head over to clio.com/UK and start your free trial today. Trust us, you'll wonder how you ever work without it. Now let's get back to the show. Let's talk about data protection. Everyone loves a bit of data protection. With obviously increasing concerns around data protection, what are the main compliance issues financial services companies need to be aware of?
Obviously data protection, I've spent a good amount of time there as a trainee. Really enjoyed that seat. And as you said, yeah, it's a big topic on a lot of people's agendas. I think one of the key things that's obviously coming up a lot now is the use of AI in financial services. So kind of the connection between using people's information, using artificial intelligence to make your systems, your processes, etc., more efficient, but also doing that in a way that is compliant with laws that are incoming about the use of AI systems. And I think that's probably the main thing that people need to keep in mind. So at least in the UK, there's still a lot of discussion about what AI regulation is going to look like. There are lots of different regulators who kind of have a hand in shaping AI regulation. So you'll have the FCA, you'll have the Competition and Markets Authority, you'll have the Information Commissioner's Office, obviously from a data protection perspective. So they're still working out what AI regulation is going to look like. But I think there's going to be a lot more focus on the use of AI systems, making sure that they're being used in a way that's fair, that still upholds people's data protection rights, but also doesn't mean that, financial services companies using them kind of fall behind the curve in a sense, because everybody wants to keep up. Everyone wants to make sure that they're, remaining competitive. And so they want to use these systems, whether it's for doing people's credit checks or, background checks on people, for example, when they're applying for loans. But they want to be able to do that in a way that is compliant. And I think it's going to be quite a delicate balance. So I'd probably say that's the most important thing for people to keep an eye out. So at the moment, I know that the EU has introduced kind of an AI Act. And even though obviously we're not in the EU, it is good to keep an eye on what's happening in Europe, because that will sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes give an indication of what the UK might do. There are obviously areas where, we have completely diverged from them, but I would definitely say that that is something to keep an eye out for, because it's likely that some of the features of that act will be replicated in the UK. So that's definitely an area that I would say financial services companies need to kind of keep their eye out for. Generally, we get a lot of questions about kind of retention of customer information. So in, I guess, an age where it's really important to try and keep a record of what's happening in terms of relationship with customers from a financial services perspective, whether that's for kind of fraud protection purposes or protecting yourself against litigation down the line. A lot of people ask questions about how long they should be keeping customers' records for. And there are lots of different regulations and lots of different regulators that play a part in what the kind of length of time you keep customer information for should be. But again, from a data protection perspective, all of those different requirements do need to be balanced with the need to make sure that you're not holding people's data for longer than you should do, not keeping it for longer than is needed for whichever purpose you're using it for. So again, I think that's a more specific area, but something that comes up quite a lot and has a kind of data protection angle for financial services companies.
Yeah, and I always say specific is terrific. So thank you for those examples. Really, really helpful. Let's switch up a little bit, because I want to talk about a topic that I know you're passionate about, which is diversity and inclusion. And I know you're a member of the steering committee for Hogan Lovells Black and Minority Ethnic Network. So what initiatives have you been part of? What's been their impact? What's your passion? Share more.
Yeah, so I've been on the steering committee for we call it the Real Network. So it's Race and Ethnicity at Hogan Lovells, REAHL. We're very, very proud of that name. So I've been on the steering committee since 2019. So a long-standing committee member. And essentially we're there to support the firm in the initiatives that it comes up with to progress, develop, support Black and ethnic minority lawyers at the firm. And that has taken a lot of different formats. So a lot of what we do is around what we call kind of race fluency. So making sure that people in the office feel comfortable talking about race. They understand different concepts around race, diversity, ethnicity, etc. And they're able to have like an open and engaging discussion about those concepts, because you find that a lot of the time, if you come in and you try to kind of impose this idea of, okay, this is how we're going to do things, this is a new policy, and everybody simply has to follow it because it's important from a DEI perspective to make sure that everyone's included, etc. If people don't have the tools to talk about race comfortably and openly, a lot of those things tend not to be successful. And so we really try to run a campaign to make sure that, okay, everybody understands at a base level different issues around race and feels comfortable talking about them. So we went as far as running like a comms campaign where we had posters up in the lifts, and they cover topics like, is it okay to ask my colleague where they're from, or where they're really from? Is it okay to talk to my colleague about fasting, for example? So there were lots of different things that we thought people might not feel comfortable to openly ask questions about, but might need information around. So we did a lot around that. In terms of my specific role on the committee, so I am really passionate about recruitment. That is my thing. It's always been my thing since I joined the firm, and specifically recruitment of diverse talent. And so one of the main initiatives that I run on the steering committee is a yearly open day for Black and ethnic minority students slash aspiring lawyers. Some of them are graduates. And so what that is a day where they come into the firm and they sit through various different sessions, application workshops, commercial awareness workshops, panel discussions from trainees, panel discussions from lawyers. All of that is to try and help them to make more confident and eventually successful applications to the firm. Because you find that one of the big pitfalls, especially from people from diverse backgrounds, is that they don't get enough legal work experience. They don't get enough exposure to law firms such as Hogan Lovells. And I suppose that hinders them when it comes to applying, because in terms of being able to show, okay, I've been committed to this career because I've done all of these things and I've spent time at all of these law firms, sometimes they simply don't have that because they don't have the right networks. And so what this does is it opens up the doors of the firm. There are no entry requirements, so it's not, please submit an application to come. It's really like first come, first served. And it just gives them something that they can be able to say, okay, I've got this experience. I spent a day at this firm. These are the people that I've spoken to. This is what I've learned. And the whole point is to make it more likely that they will make a successful application to the firm. So we've had a lot of success with that open day. And what we do is we track people. So when they do eventually apply and hopefully, become successful, become trainees, obviously not everybody will, but many of them do. We track back to see, what events have they attended, and a lot of them will have attended the Real Open Day or other similar initiatives. So that's been really useful for us, I think, in terms of just widening access to the firm. And there are various different initiatives that we do, but that's the one specifically that I run. So there's that. I would say that's kind of the main thing that I'm responsible for. But also when people are in the firm, so I run various different schemes. So we've got what's called the Real Buddy scheme, for example. So when people come through on the vacation scheme, they are offered the chance to have a buddy from the Race and Ethnicity Network. And that buddy is not necessarily a lawyer. So we have people from legal and business services who partake as mentors. And all that is to give people on the vacation scheme another point of contact in the firm, somebody who is a member of our Race and Ethnicity Network and who can give them guidance whilst they're on the VAC scheme, talk to them about what we do around diversity and inclusion, and just make sure that they get a kind of different angle to understanding who we are as a firm. Because vacation scheme, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you might not get all of that if you don't get to engage with people, in different parts of the firm in that very short space of time. So it's just to give them that extra bit of support. And hopefully by the time they then come to their interview at the end, they've got more of an understanding of who Hogan Lovells are, and hopefully makes it more likely that they'll be successful. So there are a couple of initiatives that I run that I suppose are supposed to make sure that we are, recruiting a diverse pool of people coming into the firm, and making sure that people feel supported and they understand that this is a firm that they would kind of be included in when they get here.
Yeah, and it's creating that sense of belonging, isn't it, as well, which is super important. Again, you gave some fantastic examples. Thanks for that. Probably quite a big question, but how do you see diversity evolving in the legal sector, particularly thinking about it from trainee level through to senior associate and even managing partner level?
Good question. I mean, when I joined the firm, which back in 2017, there was a lot of focus around diversity of gender. So lots of firms were focused at that time about in terms of making sure that they get women not just coming into the firm, but progressing, setting targets for, like the level of partnership that would be made up by women, for example. And there was quite a heavy focus on that. And I think a lot of firms have been quite successful in meeting those goals. And there wasn't, at least at that time, very much discussion about racial and ethnic diversity. I think now it's definitely more prominently on the agenda for a lot of the big law firms. That's also partly because it's been client driven. So you find that a lot of clients are requesting information about diversity and inclusion at the firms that they are using for their legal work, putting on their panels, and making sure that they are meeting certain thresholds before they're even considered to do, a specific piece of work. So some of that is driven by clients. And so I do think a lot of it is filtering through because law firms are thinking a lot more innovatively now about how to make sure that they do get diverse people coming through the doors. And And not just that, but also progressing. So everything is taken in stages, but before the focus was, okay, how do we recruit, making sure that people come in. But then there's a lot of discussion about retention rates and what we call the stay gap. So the difference between the amount of time that somebody from a Black or ethnic minority background stays at a law firm compared with their white counterparts. And you find that at a lot of law firms, there is a big difference between the length of tenure for Black and ethnic minority associates, for example. And so now I think a lot of firms, including Hogan Lovells, are focusing more heavily on, okay, when people are here, how do we make sure that they stay? What is it that helps them, to be retained, to feel included and feel like they want to stay at this firm? And I think a lot of firms are following that same kind of train. So looking a lot more at that kind of like inclusion point. Also the topic of equity. So before it used to be kind of equality, but now this idea that not necessarily treating everybody equally, but treating people differently based on their specific needs. So that idea that we should be treating people equitably has definitely come to the fore. So where people talk about DEI, the E now stands for equity rather than equality. And if somebody needs a specific level of support, you meet them at their point of need, which is obviously very useful for people from diverse backgrounds. The other thing that I would say is that there are different aspects of diversity which I think are also now becoming quite important. So a lot of firms are looking at, for example, social mobility. At Hogan Lovells, we recently established a social mobility network. So looking at the support for people who haven't necessarily come from the same socioeconomic background as other people in the firm or the kind of majority group of the firm, but ensuring that, again, they get into the firm, they progress, they are, developed whilst they're here is a really important thing for a lot of law firms. And also I would say neurodiversity, again, has become a big topic. It's always been important, but I think now a lot of firms are waking up to that because diversity and inclusion is sometimes slightly easier to tackle or at least identify issues with when it's things that are visible. So if you can see that someone is a woman or you can see somebody is Black or from an ethnic minority, you have a specific approach to supporting them, developing them, because the issues that they might face, it's easier to know what they might be because you can physically see what characteristics they fall within. Whereas I think where people have, I guess, some characteristics of diversity that are not always visible, it is a little bit more difficult to identify those initially. And I think a lot of really good work is being done. I mean, I don't know about other law firms because I'm not there, but a lot of good work is being done at Hogan Lovells to make sure that people are supporting those who are from neurodiverse backgrounds. And we've done a lot. So we had an autism visibility week, which was really, really helpful. But just teaching people about the kind of different aspects of neurodiversity and how they would like to, how they should be addressed in the workplace and how we can make sure that we support people who face different issues that you might not always be able to see just from looking at them. So that's how I think, in the next few years, the kind of DEI agenda of firms changing, because I think there will be a continued focus on race and ethnicity. But I think they're going to start focusing a lot more on neurodiversity, social mobility, and I guess at that point something else will become, the main area of focus. But I do think, it's controversial because people say, you should focus on everything. But I do think that it's good that, people have something on their agenda. They do things to try and improve the experience of people who might be from a specific background or face a specific hardship. They see what works and then they kind of replicate that for other different types of diversity, which I think is probably the only real way that a lot of these things will get dealt with. So yeah, and there is no end date. There's never going to be, okay, everybody is being treated the same and everybody has a perfect experience. There are always going to be issues, but I think firms' approaches to dealing with them are going to change and develop, and I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, and it's clear that you're taking action, right? And progress over perfection. You're continuously looking to progress, get better, and as you say, there will be moving parts to it all. But again, really good overview there. Thank you. Because you're also the co-founder of the Black Women in Law Network. So could you tell us a bit about that network, and are there any upcoming projects you're excited about you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes, I can tell you about the network. So it's called the Black Women's Law Network. It's funny, we actually initially started off through Clubhouse. So, during lockdown days when lots of people were on the Clubhouse app, I know that you were on there as well, because we had a few sessions on there. I initially ran those Clubhouse sessions because, to be honest, everyone was inside. It was quite easy to kind of gather around the lawyers that I knew and get them to speak on panels about different aspects of working as a Black woman in the law. When everybody kind of went back outside, the Clubhouse version ended, and there was a lot of discussion about bringing it back in real life, but I didn't at the time know quite what that would look like. And thankfully, I connected with Lola Rose Avery, who's my co-founder, and a few other people who are now kind of our committee members, and just working out how we could do this in a way that works for people in real life. And so we've got lots of input from different people, and obviously from the Steerco itself. And what we've now got is a network which is there to kind of help Black women lawyers, aspiring lawyers as well, to kind of connect, learn from each other. And we do that in a variety of formats. We've had a launch party, which was great, just to get everybody in the same room, mingling, mixing, get to know each other before we get into our kind of actual formal events. We've done a few collaborative events. So we have worked with the East London Business Alliance and Linklaters to hold 2 sessions that both held at Linklaters offices. One was about the power of networking, and another one was a career insights for lawyers event. But making sure that our members kind of get access to different people in the legal industry who they might be able to learn from, connect with, and use for their development, essentially. But also the key thing really is for people to be able to make friends, because what we found is that, at least for a lot of Black women in the law, they are working in companies or working at law firms where they might be one of a very few, or one of a group of very few people. So it kind of helps to people to kind of expand that network that they've got, and interact with people who are in a similar position to them but might not work at the same firm. So it's really to give them that base, that friendship that they might not get elsewhere. Our Instagram is Black Women's Law Network, so please do reach out if you're interested in becoming a member, so that we can make sure that you get all the information about what we're doing next first. Because we found that we put things out on our socials and tickets disappear in a matter of hours. So we're trying to make sure that we get this membership thing right, so that people find out about the information first before it goes out to kind of the general public. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's a testament to the great work and value that you're providing. And, this has been a thoroughly enjoyable conversation, as I knew it was going to be, full of lots of practical, tactical insights as well, and your career journey, which is inspiring for many listening. So just finally then, you volunteered to speak at legal events focusing on diversity. What message do you hope to convey for aspiring professionals from diverse backgrounds? And what advice would you give for those interested in pursuing a career in financial regulatory sectors?
Oh gosh, great question. I would definitely say, in terms of my experience having worked as a Black woman lawyer at Hogan Lovells, at a firm like this for as many years as I have, I would definitely say the best thing that you can do is use what makes you different to your advantage. I think for a very long time, there was never really a spotlight on people who are different, and everybody felt the need to kind of assimilate and be like everybody else to be successful. Whereas there are a lot more examples now of people who do things differently, who are from different backgrounds, who are successful in law, and who have made that their thing. So whatever that is for you, I think use that uniqueness as your way to become successful in the law, because what you'll find is that in terms of being relatable to clients and to other people do like that aspect of difference. And that's helped me massively, having different things to connect with people on, just giving people a different perspective. I think you often get when you are from a kind of diverse background and you've had a slightly different route into the law. So really try to use that as the thing that makes you stand out for positive reasons. And I think in terms of financial regulation, I would definitely say stay on top of what's going on. There are a lot of things I think in financial services that people would be familiar with because they use financial services every day. You have bank accounts. Well, most people do. You have bank accounts. People use crypto. People invest, and these are the things that are actually quite common to us in our day to day. And so becoming a financial services lawyer is almost an obvious choice when you interact with these products and services on a day-to-day basis, because you can often give advice about what a customer would expect to see, what a customer experience would be to a client, because you effectively are that customer. So I would say, like, use your real life experience to kind of govern where you end up in financial services law, because actually that tends to be what makes you a good lawyer, someone who can think like a consumer. And obviously you would have the business knowledge as well, having worked with various different clients. So it's much easier than you think to enjoy. And yeah, just keep your options open, like expand your horizons. I think, like I said, there are lots of areas of law which tend to get a massive spotlight. And I think it's really good to kind of explore different areas that you might not have obviously thought about, but which might end up being really useful for you. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, your journey is a testament to that. You gave a shout out before to the Black Women's Law Network socials. I'd love for you, because I'm sure our listeners want to learn more about your career, or indeed Hogan Lovells. Where can they go to find out more about anything we've discussed today? Feel free to share any social media handles, any website links. We'll also share them with this episode for you too.
Yes, sure. So I've got a dedicated Twitter page for law related things, which I'm going to be posting on more. It's just Law with Nikki. And sorry, it's not called Twitter anymore. It's X now. So, Law with Nikki is my specific page for law related updates on X. And then, yeah, the Black Women's Law Network is my other social media handle, which I am at the stage of still running the accounts with the committee, because we're a small team, but it's BW Law Network on X, and then Black Women's Law Network on Instagram.
Fabulous. Well, Nikki, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Legally Speaking podcast. Wishing you lots of continued success with your career, but for now, from all of us, over and out. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you like the content here, why not check out our world-leading content and collaboration hub, the Legally Speaking Club, over on Discord. Go to our website, www.legallyspeakingpodcast.com, for the link to join our community there. Over and out.